Canada, the second largest country on Earth. But how did it go from frozen wilderness to modern powerhouse? How did a land covered in ice become home to millions? And why does everyone think Canadians are so nice? You clicked on this video because you want to know the entire history of Canada, and that's exactly what you're getting. No fluff, no boring textbook stuff, just the real story of how this massive country came to be. I've spent weeks researching every major turning point, every conflict, every decision that shaped Canada into what it is today. And here's something most people don't realize. Canada wasn't always the peaceful, polite nation everyone imagines. There were brutal wars, betrayals, near disasters that almost tore the country apart. The Canada you know today is the result of thousands of years of struggle, survival, and strategic decisions that could have gone completely differently. So if you've ever wondered how Canada went from being a collection of rival colonies to one of the most successful countries in the world, stick around, because this story has more twists than you'd expect. Let's start with something that blows most people's minds. Canada's history doesn't begin with Europeans showing up. It begins over 15,000 years ago. During the last ice age, massive glaciers covered most of North America. But as the ice started melting, people began moving in. These weren't just random wanderers. They were skilled hunters and survivors who crossed from Asia into North America through a land bridge that connected Siberia to Alaska. Over thousands of years, they spread across the continent, developing distinct cultures, languages, and ways of life. By the time Europeans arrived, there were hundreds of indigenous nations living across what we now call Canada. The Haudenosaunee in the east, the Cree across the forests and plains, the Inuit in the Arctic, the Haida on the Pacific coast. Each group had complex societies, trade networks, and their own systems of government. Some built longhouses that could hold entire families. Others lived in perfect harmony with the harsh Arctic environment, hunting seals and whales with incredible skill. These weren't primitive people waiting for civilization to arrive. They were thriving communities with rich traditions. And this is where most history classes get it wrong. They skip over thousands of years of indigenous history and jump straight to Columbus. But understanding Canada means understanding that this land was never empty. It was full of life, culture, and history, long before any European ship touched its shores. But here's where everything changes. In the year 1000, almost 500 years before Columbus, Vikings landed in Newfoundland. Led by Leif Erikson, they established a small settlement called L'Anse aux Meadows. But it didn't last. Conflicts with indigenous peoples and the brutal environment drove them away. For centuries, their story was considered a myth. Then, in the 1960s, archaeologists found the ruins, proof that Europeans had reached North America long before anyone thought possible. But the Vikings didn't stick around. The real European colonization began much later. Fast forward to 1497, John Catt, an Italian explorer sailing for England, reached the coast of Newfoundland. He didn't find gold or spices, but he found something almost as valuable: fish. The Grand Banks off Newfoundland were packed with cod. Within years, fishing boats from England, France, Spain, and Portugal were making regular trips across the Atlantic. And this is the part most people miss. Canada's colonization started because of fish, not gold. While Spain was plundering South America for riches, European powers were fighting over fishing rights in the North Atlantic. Then came the French. In 1534, Jacques Cartier sailed up the St. Lawrence River, claiming the land for France. He was looking for a route to Asia, but instead he found a gateway into the heart of North America. The French realized something crucial. This land was perfect for the fur trade. European fashion at the time was obsessed with beaver felt hats, and Canada had millions of beavers. Within decades, the fur trade became the economic backbone of New France. French traders built relationships with indigenous nations, especially the Huron and Algonquin. These weren't just business deals, they were alliances. The French needed indigenous knowledge to survive and navigate the wilderness. In return, Indigenous peoples received European goods like metal tools and weapons. But this alliance came with a cost. It pulled indigenous nations into European conflicts and introduced devastating diseases like smallpox, which wiped out entire communities. In 608, Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec City. This was the first permanent French settlement in Canada. Champlain wasn't just an explorer. He was a diplomat, a soldier, and a visionary who understood that survival meant cooperation with indigenous peoples. Under his leadership, New France began to grow. Fur traders pushed deeper into the continent, building forts and trading posts. Missionaries followed, trying to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity. The French weren't interested in mass settlement like the English colonies to the south. They wanted trade, not farms. So New France remained small, with only a few thousand settlers scattered along the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes. But here's where it gets complicated. While the French were building alliances in the north, the English were establishing colonies along the Atlantic coast. And they wanted in on the fur trade too. In 1670, the English created the Hudson's Bay Company, giving it a monopoly over a massive territory called Rupert's Land. This wasn't just a company. It was basically a government with its own army, controlling an area larger than Western Europe. The Hudson's Bay Company built forts along Hudson Bay and James Bay, cutting into French trade routes. Tensions exploded. For the next century, France and England fought a series of wars, both in Europe and in North America. These weren't just battles between armies. They were proxy wars, fought through indigenous allies. The French allied with the Huron, Algonquin, and later the Abnaki. The English allied with the Iroquois Confederacy. Indigenous nations weren't just pawns in these conflicts. They had their own strategic interests and used European rivalries to strengthen their own positions. And this is where things get brutal. The wars between France and England in North America were savage. Entire villages were burned. Civilians were killed. In 1755, during the 7 Years' War, the British forcibly removed thousands of French-speaking Acadians from what is now Nova Scotia. This wasn't a military operation. It was ethnic cleansing. Families were torn apart. Communities were destroyed. Many Acadians died during the deportation. Others ended up in Louisiana, where their descendants became the Cajuns. This dark chapter is often glossed over, but it's a crucial part of Canada's history. The 7 Years' War ended in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris. France surrendered all its North American territories to Britain. Just like that, New France became British. But the French-speaking population didn't disappear. They stayed, kept their language, and maintained their Catholic faith. The British realized they had a problem. How do you govern a colony where most people speak a different language and follow a different religion? The solution was the Quebec Act of 1774. It allowed French Canadians to keep their language, religion, and legal system. This was a huge deal. It's one of the reasons Quebec remained part of Canada instead of joining the American Revolution. Speaking of which, let's talk about the Americans. In 1776, the 13 colonies declared independence from Britain. The American Revolution changed everything. Thousands of loyalists, people who remained loyal to the British Crown, fled north to Canada. They settled in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and what would become Ontario. These weren't just refugees. They were farmers, merchants, and soldiers who transformed Canada's population and culture. The influx of loyalists shifted the balance. Now there were significant English-speaking populations in areas that had been predominantly French. In 1791, Britain split Quebec into two colonies, Lower Canada, which was mostly French, and Upper Canada, which was mostly English. This division set the stage for future conflicts. But here's where Canada almost ceased to exist. In 1812, the United States invaded. Americans thought conquering Canada would be easy. After all, Britain was distracted fighting Napoleon in Europe. But they were wrong. Canadian militias, British soldiers, and indigenous allies, led by leaders like Tecumseh, fought back fiercely. The War of 1812 was a disaster for everyone involved. Both sides burned each other's capital cities. The White House was set on fire by British troops. But Canada held. The war ended in 1814 with basically no territorial changes, but it had a huge psychological impact. Canadians, both English and French, had fought together to defend their land. It created a shared sense of identity. For the first time, people started thinking of themselves as Canadian, not just British subjects or French colonists. After the war, Canada entered a period of rapid change. Immigration exploded. British and Irish settlers poured in, clearing forests and establishing farms. Cities grew. Montreal and Toronto transformed from small towns into major urban centers. But with growth came tension. The old colonial system wasn't working. A small group of elites controlled the government, while ordinary people had little say. In 1837, rebellions broke out in both Upper and Lower Canada. Farmers and reformers demanded democratic reforms. The rebellions were crushed, but they sent a clear message. Change was needed. Britain responded by sending Lord Durham to investigate. His report, published in 1839, recommended two major changes. First, unite Upper and Lower Canada into one colony. Second, give Canadians more control over their own government. In 1841, the two Canadas were merged into the province of Canada. But here's the twist. Durham also recommended assimilating the French population. He called them a people with no history and no literature. This racist attitude shaped British policy for decades and fueled resentment in Quebec that still exists today. But the province of Canada was a mess. The English and French populations were locked in constant political gridlock. Every decision required approval from both sides, and they rarely agreed on anything. By the 1860s, it was clear the system was broken. Meanwhile, something else was happening. The United States had just finished a devastating civil war. It emerged with the largest army in the world and a growing sense of manifest destiny. The belief that it was destined to control all of North America. Canadian leaders looked south and got nervous. If the U.S. decided to invade, Canada wouldn't stand a chance as separate bickering colonies. They needed to unite. This is where confederation comes in. In 1864, representatives from the province of Canada, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick met in Charlottetown to discuss forming a union. The meetings continued in Quebec City and London. After years of negotiation, the British North America Act was passed in 1867, creating the Dominion of Canada. On July 1, 1867, Canada officially became a country. Sort of. It wasn't fully independent. Britain still controlled foreign policy and could overrule Canadian laws, but it was a start. The new country had 4 provinces: Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. Sir John A. Macdonald became the first Prime Minister. His vision was ambitious: expand Canada from coast to coast, build a transcontinental railway, and fill the vast Western Territories with settlers. But here's the problem. The Western Territories weren't empty. The Métis, people of mixed indigenous and European ancestry, had been living there for generations. They had their own culture, language, and way of life. In 1869, when Canada tried to take control of the Red River area in what's now Manitoba, the Métis resisted. Led by Louis Riel, they established a provisional government and negotiated with Canada to enter confederation on their own terms. In 1870, Manitoba became a province, but the Canadian government didn't honor all its promises. Métis land rights were ignored. Settlers flooded in. Within years, the Métis were pushed out of their own territory. Riel would return 15 years later to lead another rebellion, but that story gets even darker. Canada was expanding fast. In 1871, British Columbia joined, but only after Canada promised to build a railway connecting it to the east. In 1873, Prince Edward Island joined. The country was growing, but it was fragile. The economy was weak. The railway project was plagued by scandals and delays, and the indigenous peoples who had lived on these lands for thousands of years were being systematically pushed aside. This is one of the darkest chapters in Canadian history. As settlers moved west, the government needed to deal with indigenous nations who had treaties dating back generations. Instead of honoring these agreements, Canada imposed a new system. Between 1871 and 1921, the government signed a series of numbered treaties with indigenous nations. These treaties promised reserves, money, and supplies in exchange for land. But the government rarely kept its promises. Reserves were often located on the worst land. Promised payments and supplies never arrived, and that's not even the worst part. Starting in the 1880s, the Canadian government created the residential school system. Indigenous children were forcibly taken from their families and sent to boarding schools run by churches. The goal was cultural genocide. Kill the Indian in the child. As one government official put it, children were forbidden from speaking their languages or practicing their traditions. Abuse was rampant. Thousands of children died from disease, neglect, and abuse. The last residential school didn't close until 1996. Think about that. 1996. This isn't ancient history. The trauma from residential schools still affects indigenous communities today. In 2008, the Canadian government finally apologized, but an apology doesn't undo generations of harm. Back to the railway. In 1885, the Canadian Pacific Railway was finally completed. It was an engineering marvel, cutting through mountains and across prairies. But it came at a cost. Thousands of Chinese workers were brought in to build the most dangerous sections through the Rocky Mountains. They were paid less than white workers and given the most hazardous jobs. Hundreds died from accidents, avalanches, and explosions. After the railway was finished, Canada passed the Chinese Immigration Act, imposing a head tax on Chinese immigrants to keep them out. Policy stayed in place until 1923, when Canada banned Chinese immigration entirely. Again, this isn't ancient history. These policies shaped who could become Canadian for decades. 1885 was also the year of the Northwest Rebellion. Remember Louis Riel? He returned from exile to lead another Métis uprising, this time in Saskatchewan. The Métis and their indigenous allies were desperate. The buffalo were gone, wiped out by overhunting. Promised supplies never came. They were starving. Riel tried to negotiate, but the Canadian government sent troops instead. The rebellion was crushed in a few months. Riel was captured, tried for treason, and hanged. His execution divided the country. English Canadians saw him as a traitor. French Canadians saw him as a martyr, defending minority rights. The divide between English and French Canada deepened. But Canada kept growing. Waves of immigrants arrived, mostly from Europe. The government offered free land to anyone willing to farm the prairies. Ukrainians, Germans, Scandinavians, and others flooded in, transforming the West. Towns sprang up overnight. Wheat became Canada's biggest export. By 1905, two more provinces were created, Alberta and Saskatchewan. Canada now stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Then came World War I. When Britain declared war on Germany in 1914, Canada was automatically at war too. Remember, Canada still wasn't fully independent. At first, Canadians were excited. Thousands volunteered, thinking it would be a grand adventure. They had no idea of what was coming. The trenches of Europe were hell. Poison gas, machine guns, artillery that could blow you apart without warning. Canadian soldiers fought in some of the war's bloodiest battles. Ypres, the Somme, Vimy Ridge. That last one is especially important. In April 1917, Canadian forces captured Vimy Ridge, a strategic position that British and French armies had failed to take. It was a stunning victory, but it came at a terrible cost. Over 3,000 Canadians died, and 7,000 more were wounded. But something changed at Vimy. Canadian troops had fought together as Canadians, not just as colonists. Many historians say this was the moment Canada truly became a nation. But the war divided Canada at home. In 1917, the government introduced conscription, mandatory military service. English Canadians mostly supported it. French Canadians opposed it, seeing it as an English war that had nothing to do with them. Riots broke out in Quebec. Soldiers were sent in. People died. The wounds from conscription lasted for generations. World War I killed over 60,000 Canadians. Entire towns lost their young men. The country was traumatized. But Canada emerged from the war with a new status. In 1919, Canada signed the Treaty of Versailles independently of Britain. It was a small step, but it mattered. Canada was starting to act like its own country. The 1920s were a weird time. The war was over, the economy boomed, people wanted to forget the horrors and have fun. Jazz cars, movies, Canadian cities modernized rapidly. Women who had worked in factories during the war demanded the right to vote. By 1919, most Canadian women could vote in federal elections, though it took until 1940 for Quebec to allow women to vote provincially. But underneath the glamour, problems were brewing. The economy was unstable. Inequality was growing. And then in 1929, everything collapsed. The Great Depression hit Canada like a hammer. Stock markets crashed. Banks failed. Unemployment skyrocketed. By 1933, nearly 30% of Canadians were out of work. Families lost their homes. Men rode the rails looking for jobs that didn't exist. The prairies were devastated by drought and dust storms, turning farmland into desert. The government's response was inadequate. Prime Minister R.B. Bennett tried relief programs, but they weren't enough. People were desperate, and desperate times create political extremism. Communist and fascist movements gained followers. The Social Credit Party emerged in Alberta. The Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, a socialist party that would later become the NDP, was founded. Canada's political landscape was shifting. Then World War II started. In 1939, when Britain declared war on Germany, Canada didn't automatically follow. Instead, Parliament debated and made its own decision. Canada declared war 1 week after Britain. It was a symbolic moment of independence, but make no mistake, Canada went all in. Over 1 million Canadians served in the military. The economy shifted to war production. Factories churned out planes, ships, tanks, and ammunition. Unemployment vanished overnight. Women again filled roles in factories and farms. Canadian forces fought in every major theater. The Battle of Britain, the invasion of Italy, D-Day, the liberation of the Netherlands. Over 45,000 Canadians died. But the war had a dark side at home too. In 1942, the Canadian government forced all people of Japanese descent, most of them Canadian citizens, into internment camps. Their property was seized and sold. Their rights were stripped away. They were treated as enemies simply because of their ethnicity. This shameful policy wasn't officially apologized for until 1988. World War II transformed Canada. Social programs expanded. Veterans came home to a country that looked very different from the one they'd left. And this time, Canada's independence was undeniable. In 1945, Canada was a founding member of the United Nations. It wasn't following Britain's lead anymore. It was making its own decisions on the world stage. The post-war years brought massive change. Immigration exploded, but this time from different places. Italians, Greeks, Portuguese, and people from all over the world came to Canada. The country became more diverse. Cities expanded into suburbs. Highways were built. Television arrived. Canadians were getting richer, but not everyone shared equally in the prosperity. Indigenous peoples were still living in poverty on reserves. French Canadians in Quebec felt like second-class citizens in their own country. Social tensions were building. The 1960s changed everything. It was a decade of revolution everywhere, and Canada was no exception. In Quebec, something called the Quiet Revolution began. French Canadians demanded control over their own affairs. They modernized their education system, reduced the Catholic Church's power, and demanded recognition as a distinct nation. Some wanted complete independence. In 1963, a terrorist group called the Front Liberation du Québec started bombing mailboxes and government buildings. They wanted Quebec to separate from Canada by force. At the same time, Canada was becoming more socially liberal. In 1967, Pierre Trudeau, then Justice Minister, said the famous line, "The state has no business in the bedrooms of the nation." He decriminalized homosexuality and made divorce easier. In 1968, he became Prime Minister and dominated Canadian politics for the next 15 years. Trudeau was charismatic, intellectual, and polarizing. He pushed for a bilingual Canada, making French equal to English at the federal level. He expanded social programs and promoted multiculturalism. But he also faced a crisis that nearly tore the country apart. In October 1970, the FLQ kidnapped a British diplomat and a Quebec cabinet minister. The cabinet minister, Pierre Laporte, was murdered. Trudeau's response was dramatic. He invoked the War Measures Act, suspending civil liberties and sending the army into Quebec. Hundreds of people were arrested without charges. The crisis ended, but it left scars. The question of Quebec's place in Canada wasn't going away. In 1976, the parti Québécois, a separatist party, won power in Quebec. Their goal was clear: independence. In 1980, they held a referendum asking Quebecers if they wanted to negotiate sovereignty. The no side won, but with only 60% of the vote. 40% of Quebecers wanted out. The issue wasn't settled. Trudeau's other major achievement came in 1982. After years of negotiation, Canada patriated its constitution. This meant Canada could amend its own constitution without asking Britain. It also included the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, guaranteeing rights like freedom of speech, religion, and equality. But there was a catch. Quebec never signed the agreement. They felt betrayed, believing the deal didn't protect their distinct culture. This constitutional crisis would haunt Canada for decades. The 1980s and 90s were turbulent. Brian Mulroney became Prime Minister in 1984 and pushed for free trade with the United States. The debate was fierce. Critics said it would destroy Canadian culture and independence. Supporters said it was necessary for economic growth. In 1988, the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement passed. In 1994, it expanded to include Mexico, becoming NAFTA. Love it or hate it, it fundamentally changed Canada's economy. But the constitutional issue wouldn't die. In 1987, Mulroney tried to bring Quebec into the Constitution with the Meech Lake Accord. It failed. In 1992, he tried again with the Charlottetown Accord. It failed too. And in 1995, Quebec held another referendum. This time, it was terrifyingly close. The no side won by less than 1%. 50.58% wanted to stay in Canada. 49.42% wanted to leave. Canada came within 54,000 votes of breaking apart. The close call shocked the country. Federal politicians realized they needed to acknowledge Quebec's uniqueness without granting independence. It was a delicate balance that continues today. Since then, separatist sentiment has cooled, but it never completely disappeared. The late 90s and 2000s saw Canada stabilize and prosper. The economy grew. The government balanced its budget. Canada became known internationally for peacekeeping, multiculturalism, and progressive values. In 2005, Canada became the fourth country in the world to legalize same-sex marriage nationwide. Indigenous issues gained more attention. Land claims were settled, apologies were issued, but real reconciliation remained elusive. In 2015, Justin Trudeau, Pierre's son, became Prime Minister, promising a new era of progressive politics. He championed diversity, climate action, and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. But like his father, he proved divisive. Some see him as a champion of Canadian values. Others see him as all style, no substance. Canada today faces new challenges. Climate change threatens the Arctic and coastal communities. Economic inequality is growing. Housing has become unaffordable in major cities. The relationship with indigenous peoples is improving, but still fraught with broken promises and systemic discrimination. And questions about national identity persist. What does it mean to be Canadian in a country with no dominant culture, where people come from everywhere, and unity often feels fragile? So that's Canada. From ice sheets to indigenous nations, from French fur traders to British conquest, from rebellions to confederation, from world wars to constitutional crisis, from near breakup to modern prosperity. It's a story of survival, compromise, and constant negotiation between different peoples, languages, and visions. Canada never had a violent revolution. It never had a clean break from its colonial past. Instead, it evolved slowly, messily, through endless debate and compromise. That's both its weakness and its strength. What can you take from this? First, history is never simple. Canada's story is full of contradictions. It's a country built on indigenous land that still struggles with reconciliation. It's a nation that prides itself on multiculturalism, but has a history of racism and exclusion. It's a place that almost fell apart multiple times, but somehow held together. Second, identity is complicated. Being Canadian doesn't mean one thing. It means different things to different people, and that's okay. Unity doesn't require uniformity. And third, the story isn't over. The decisions made today about climate, about reconciliation, about who gets to call themselves Canadian, will shape the next chapter. History isn't just about the past. It's about understanding how we got here, so we can figure out where we're going. Canada's history shows that even when things seem impossible, when the country appears on the verge of collapse, people find a way forward. Not through grand gestures, but through small compromises, difficult conversations, and the belief that staying together is worth the effort. That's the Canadian story. Messy, complicated, and still being written.